I'm Steve Loach. I work with BHP WAIO. I'm the Senior Geologist for Reconciliations and have been for some time. And F-Series reconciliations is my thing, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. In particular, what I'm interested in is the role of F-Series reconciliations, which I will define later if anyone's not familiar with them, in business improvement, and in particular in the improvement of models, so resource and reserve models, and some of the benefits that this process can provide to your business. I'm just going to start my timer here because I'm going to try to be very time conscious despite rambling on about 20th century ocean liners. I'm going to start with a very brief introduction to F-Series reconciliations, and I'm going to make a couple of little disclaimers at the start. And the first one is that I'm not allowed to mention any of the specific mine sites by name, because I don't have the general manager's approval for each of these sites. I actually formally have to have the general manager's approval before I can mention any mine site's name. So I won't be mentioning any mine site's name. And I also need BHP's approval to mention any software or any external companies, just in case I'm thought to be providing an official BHP endorsement for that company or that software. So I said to the communication specialist, I said, that's very difficult because I use this software and I interact with this company a lot. It's very difficult to do a 20-minute talk on this without mentioning this. And I said, so what's your advice? And they said, well, just talk about something else. If you feel the urge to talk about it, talk about something else. So of late, my wife and I have developed a very strong interest in medieval siege warfare. And whilst planning our recent holiday, we were looking to a holiday in the future that would accommodate this, and it turns out that the greatest concentration of castles anywhere in Europe, and probably in the world, is in southern Wales. So our next trip is likely to be to Snowdonia. And when I'm there, I will have to make a decision because my boss over there always likes me to work hard. She always likes me to work hard when I am on holiday. So will this be a working holiday or will this just be a holiday? So I have to ask the question, will I reconcile or will I actually have a holiday? So having navigated that difficult, now I don't have to mention any names of any companies or any software. So F-Series reconciliation. In 2002, BHP mandated that all of our operations would calculate a standard set of F-Series reconciliations. And so these you may be familiar with. They're based on the work of Harry Parker. The temptation to say Harry Potter is, overwhelming, but it's Harry Parker, who was a consultant geologist who would travel around mines all around the world, but particularly in Canada, and be asked the question, why is our mine failing? And so he would look at the reconciliation results from different mines and find that they were all disparate and they were all presented in different ways. So looking at C1, C2 and C3, this is my interpretation of the events. Anyway, he figured, is it possible to generate a series of standard reconciliation factors that could be, broadly speaking, standardized across the business and understood, and that would break out individual components, just like C1, C2 and C3 break out individual components and are mathematically agreed to or widely agreed across the business? Could we do something the same with geological reconciliation? So he came up with F1, factor 2, and factor 3. And I'm not going to dwell for a long time on what these are, but I will just very briefly cover it. So given the hole in the ground that's been mined and given the stated economic cutoff grade, you should generate a model's estimation as to how much material of value should have been extracted. And then you can compare that with either different generations of model within that depleted volume or with the actual measured production of tonnes and grade. So if you're doing the first thing, that's factor 1, which is a model-to-model comparison, and gives you an insight into the accuracy of the earlier model. So in Harry Parker's terminology, it was the long-range model compared with the short-range model. In our terminology, it's what we call the resource model and or the reserve model or the mining model, which is the model that our mine plan and our strategic decisions is based on, compared with the grade control model, which in our terminology is that model which controls extraction. That's the final best geological determination of what's in the ground. Cripes, I'm burning up my time quickly anyway. So F1 gives us an accuracy. It gives us an insight into the accuracy of the models upon which our long-term plans are based. F2 compares the extraction out of the ground compared to the measured production, taking the difficult aspect of changes in stockpiles into account as best we can. And then F3 is end-to-end. So it looks at from the long-term model to the delivery to market, and that typically, so that's typically, basically it's the multiple of F1 and F2 with some degree of flex, particularly for change in port stocks in the case of iron ore. So we also calculate another factor called F1.5 and a whole bunch of others on as well. And F1.5 is this what we call a short-term planning model compared to the grade control model. And the short-term planning model is well, it's exactly what it says. It's effectively an equivalent of the mining model, but it's updated with the most amount of information, mapping and drilling that we can throw at it to give us the best view of what's going to happen in the next 6 months. So F1.5 is really the same as F1. It compares that model with the grade control model, tries to give us insights into the accuracy of these models. So I hope that gives you a rough idea of what F1, 2, 3 is about. It applies to tonnes and to grade and to a multiple number of grades in the case of iron ore. Now, as it says there, right there, the primary objective is always corporate assurance. It's always to make sure that what we take out to the ASX and make our claims for our resources and reserves are based on models that are defensible, that are actually capable of predicting reality in some way, shape or form. But I'm sure you can understand that doing this process consistently also allows a real opportunity for detection of issues within the business and for continuous improvement. So I'm going to focus on the continuous improvement aspect of this, and I'm going to make this as quick as I can. If you are interested in this presentation has been presented at the AusIMM, and there is a paper that supports it, and that's available through the AusIMM, and it goes into this in more detail. And clearly, I'm just going to skip over even what's in this presentation just to try to make up time. But we can get the gist of the thing. We can get the gist of the messages across. There's 4 case studies to cover, and there's 13 minutes, which there's absolutely no rush. Excellent. So has anybody ever studied transatlantic airline operations? Because they're actually okay. That might be a bridge too far. Right, where were we? Yes, anti-submarine warfare in World War II. No. Okay, so here we have a case study from Mine Site 1. And essentially what we're seeing here is this particular software application that will remain unnamed was rolled out at West Australian Iron Ore in the year 2009 and has run continuously ever since. And we'll come to that. So here is a time span where we started to detect an issue with the F2 for tonnes at this particular mine site. And it turned out that quarter after quarter after quarter, that's 3 months, every 3-month group up. So year after year after year, we were progressively getting lower and lower and lower F2 tonnes results from this mine. And it was largely going undiagnosed as to what was causing this. And it prompted a number of investigations and issues. And it turned out that the main correlation that we could find was that this particular mine site's distributed along a long east-west axis. And as we were mining progressively towards the western deposit, so I've got north that way, west that way. Should I be audience friendly? North, west would be that way for you guys. So as we were mining more and more and more towards the western deposits, our F2 was reducing for tonnes. So we knew that this wasn't a model problem because the F1 was always well controlled, but it was something to do with the delivery of this material. And so essentially, to cut a fairly long story short, if you go and you look at the density information that was available for the western pits, it was being run off a series of default densities that were a simplification of a number of old density determinations going back through several iterations of drilling and several iterations of geophysical companies that had been employed and then replaced and then employed. And then what we were finding was that essentially what was determined, and it was determined by a series of re-drilling of holes and re-measurement of densities down those holes, was that the default densities that were being applied in both the reserve model or the mining model and subsequently the grade control model were too high. So we were over-promising, we were overestimating how many tons were in the ground. So given the hole in the ground that we've mined, given the cutoff grade, we were finding that the model, one model to the next model, was accurate because they were both aligned. But when you actually lifted that material out of the mine, you were not capable of delivering those tons to the supply chain or to the market. Consequently, the F2 for tons and the F3 for the overall business case were falling short by, in extreme cases, up to 10%, which is like pretty extreme. So what you see here is a red line, and the red line is the event change, which is when there was a correction was applied to the density data in the database, and then that was subsequently applied to the mining model, which was subsequently applied to the grade control model, and you can see the process comes back under control. So the process came back under control, but there was an implication because by doing this, what we'd discovered was that there was a shortfall of something like 8% in the remaining resource/reserve for that mine. So the mine's projected lifespan was shortened by a significant amount. Now that has a significant on-flow effect on the scheduling of the raising of the next mine that was scheduled to replace this mine when it finally comes to its life of mine. So you can see that by doing a process like this, what we've done is not only corrected that problem, but we've also provided an early warning to the business of a critical risk to our long-term plans. LOI determination. Those of you that work in iron ore will be familiar with the concept of LOI. So LOI stands for lost on ignition. This is the weight from a sample subsequent to initial drying. This is not the initial moisture. This is not free moisture that's driven off at 120 degrees centigrade. This is the material that is lost between that 120 degrees centigrade and 1,000 degrees centigrade that is driven off and vaporized. Typically, this material in the blast furnace will simply turn into water vapor and be blasted out the top of the furnace. So LOI is a relatively harmless contaminant in your material, and generally speaking it doesn't cause a huge amount of problems to blast furnaces because it simply vaporizes either in the sintering plant or in the blast furnace. But LOI determination is critical that you get it accurate, because if your LOI determination is inaccurate, your normalization of all the other values that are determined at 1,000 degrees centigrade will also be wrong. Might not have explained that very well then, but you have to basically return that mass. You have to put that LOI mass back in accurately so that the percentages of all the other determinants are accurately constrained when the sample or when the assay is normalized. And in the case of iron ore, because more than 50% of your material is iron, an error in LOI determination will directly and mostly affect your assay for iron. So what we see in this case is we see that across the whole of WAIO, because our database covers the whole of WAIO and can report on the whole of WAIO, for a long period of time, the LOI was consistently just a whisker underneath 1. And that's in itself is perhaps not a major corporate concern, but it is a concern because what that means is that if that number is not being accurately determined or is not accurately aligned, then something else that you probably can't detect is not accurately aligned. And in this case here, we can see LOI and iron grade determinations. You can see when one is too high, the others are too low. So after many, many months and quarters of this being observed, a in-depth investigation was launched, and it was determined that in the laboratory in question, in one of the laboratories in question, the TGA, the ovens, the thermogravimetric assessment oven, I think that's what it is, was set not to 1,000 degrees centigrade as required by ISO standards for iron ore determination, but was set at 900 degrees centigrade. And the reason for that was because the good people in the laboratory has observed whenever this oven was run at 1,000 degrees centigrade, it was frequently breaking down. And they've found that the way to fix that was to just back it off 10% and heat everything to 900 degrees centigrade. Everything's still nicely melted and everything's still, forms a lovely bead for XRF. That's not a problem. But the problem is that the Loy determination is wrong. So consequently, the mathematics that's applied to the iron determination is incorrect. And this was affecting 100% of our grade control and production samples. Now, interestingly enough, you have to look at F1 to determine this, because F1 is comparing the long-term model, whose assays were not determined by this particular lab, but by an external lab that was running at 1,000 degrees centigrade. You cannot determine it by looking at the production samples compared to grade control, because the production samples were also subjected to the same issue because they were going through the same laboratory. So, long story short, because times are ticking, we fixed the problem. And we fixed the problem in two phases, we being the business. First was we forced the ovens to run at 1,000 degrees centigrade and just spent more money on maintenance. And then the final correction came in here in option 2, where we deployed new ovens that were actually rated at 1,000 degrees centigrade and were capable of running at 1,000 degrees centigrade. And you can see that, and I'm always very careful about using the word bias, but you can see that bias was eliminated, which therefore has a positive effect on the grade determination of 100% of all of your other grade control and production samples. Lump estimation. One of the things we've done with this particular software that remains unnamed is we have developed the capability to not just reconcile the model's prediction of total tonnes and total grade, but also for the lump and fines. So our Geomet team generates a series of algorithms that look at the model, and by referencing a series of destructive tests in a geometallurgical lab, they can then take the geological characteristics of that piece of rock and make an inference as to what the geometallurgical prediction, what the split will be for lump and for fines. And what we see is initially, when we started this process at this particular mine site, the F1 was typically pretty well controlled, but the F2 was very low. We were consistently measuring lower lump proportion in the production than what was expected. And then we deployed a new algorithm that was revised with this, and initially it worked well, but over time it went out of spec, and we were underestimating the lump proportion from this mine site, and eventually, and we were over measuring. So F2 was high. We were getting more than we thought we were going to get. Now, you might say, yay, that's great from a planning point of view because you're planning for this much lump, and lump's a premium product, and we're getting more than we expected. But of course, from a supply chain optimization point of view, that's not good, because you can imagine that has impacts on all aspects of scheduling and rail, and has impacts on marketing, because how much are you expecting that you're going to be able to put to market, and so on and so forth. Anyway, once again, the key issue here turned out to be density. There was a revision of density data across the whole of WAIO, and there was an uplift in the quality of it. There were corrections for known biases, and in the estimation algorithm was then changed to take a great deal more emphasis or importance on density. Density was always part of the algorithm, but the new algorithm was deployed where density was like the key variable. And immediately you can see that the F2, which is the pink line, came to almost unity, which was just an extraordinary change in performance, which gave the geometallurgical department really strong assurance that that new algorithm was correct. That new algorithm was then, at event 3, was then deployed into the long-term planning model, and so then the F1 came into alignment as well. So event 2 was when the new algorithm went into grade control, and event 3 was when it went into the long-term planning model. And now, as you can see, the geometallurgical predictions for this particular mine site are now very high quality indeed. Final story is I've got 44 seconds, but then I gave myself some fat. This thing's going to go off in 40 seconds, but I think I've got another 5 minutes or so after that. I'm trying to make up time for us. Is dual shell to single shell estimation. Now, some strange people enjoy this thing called geostatistics and estimation of grades, and they're, well, I shouldn't, I won't comment any further than that. Some strange people enjoy this stuff, and I was always a bit skeptical because I was like, estimation, it's all a bit of a, yeah. Surely it doesn't really matter. Surely you get the right assays, you put it into the model, you just do some maths. And I didn't design our grade control system, but it seemed that whoever did thought pretty much the same kind of a thing. So all they did was we just do a series of grade blockouts. We block out where the high grade is, that's above the high grade, and then we used to take just a mathematical average of that and say that was the predicted grade for that block. Now, what happened was the geostatistical friends came along and said that's not right, and it's not right for a whole bunch of reasons that I'm not going to discuss now, but it was genuinely not right. And so when they revised that process, and essentially then we saw an improvement in F1. But the key point here is that the same people then came along and looked at our estimation method in our long-term models. And you can see the positive effect that occurred there when that change was made. By the way, that's that black line. The same people also looked at our long-term models, and we had this process whereby a low-grade shell was being produced, and then within that was a high-grade shell, and the high-grade shell was at the stated economic cutoff. And so that grade within that shell was then estimated within that shell. Geostatistically, they did it kriging. And then there's another low-grade halo around the outside. But the problem with that is that because that inner shell is being specifically designed to contain pretty much nothing other than high-grade samples, and because that shell acts as a barrier which prevents any statistical influence of anything outside that shell getting into that shell, we're over-cleaning the grade, if that makes sense to people. It's probably very poor terminology on my part. But you can see the effect here. What you tend to do is you tend to clean the grade of the high-grade shell up because nothing outside can influence the inside, and you tend to dirty up the outer shell because none of that high grade can have any influence on the outside, which is the whole point of geostatistics. Right, geostatistics is geospatial statistics. Where I am is critical to what my estimation effect is if I'm a sample. So this diagram here shows it very nicely if you're familiar with it. What we had was an artificial what's that word? A two-lumped curve. Bimodal distribution. Check that out. Bimodal distribution, which wasn't real. It's not reflective of what the samples were doing, and it's not reflective of what's actually in the real world, because we're geologists. Well, if we're lucky enough to be geologists in the room, I assume many of us are geologists, that we know that economic cutoff grade is not actually a geological entity. That's an economic entity. That's an artificial idea that is imposed on the geological context of it. It's not actually a real physical thing. We're just coming along and saying, well, economically, that's what we're interested in. Well, when the ore body was made, it wasn't made to a cutoff grade. It's not actually a geological process. What is a geological process is background mineralization. So this shell is actually geologically valid. This one is not. So we took that shell out and we're estimating within this shell. And then within that shell, we're effectively letting the assays speak for themselves. It's beautiful, isn't it? Anyway, long story short, if we look at this particular mine site's results for the month before the change was made compared to 3 months after the change was made, 2 months after the change was made, you can see that there's a lot of red angry faces here and there's a lot of green faces here. This is a step change in the reconciliation performance for this mine. This is possibly the biggest, most high impact change we've seen in any of the reconciliation factors that I've seen in my extraordinarily long time in this role, which extends back to the Crimean War, by the way. Not the current Crimean War, It's an extraordinary result. and it shows the power of correct estimation procedures and just how it can have a real world impact. Now, the implication of this is that what we are doing is we're no longer promising this high-grade material to the business. So this has a significant impact on the business looking forward, because the business has to take the hit. It has to say, like, the future might have been, we might have predicted future iron production at X grade of Fe, and now it's X minus 1% or 2%. But at least it is now a deliverable grade estimate, and it is supported. The grade estimation method is now supported by reconciliations. It's supported by the supply chain. We can actually deliver this estimation, which simplifies the business no end, because it takes out a lot of planning factors and biases from data sets and all that kind of stuff. It just says, this is the model's revised prediction. This is what we can now predict. So, running very short of time, but I do have some discussion points to make. Reconciliation is a long-term process that has to be run consistently. The temptation of, somebody said it earlier, taking the numbers in my spreadsheet and just correcting them a little bit is almost impossible to overcome. Or you set up a calculation that's going to calculate your factor this particular way and agree that that's the method. 6 months down the track, you find, oh, that method doesn't work for us. I won't change the data, but I'll change the method, because obviously the method was not correctly defined. Cannot do it that way. You have to set up a consistent and accurate definition of what your factors are and keep it, because otherwise the result that you calculated 5 years ago will not match what you're calculating today. So this is a strategic activity. So rarely, if ever, will any genuine improvements be based on a small number of events. If you roll a system out like this, it's highly unlikely that after 2 or 3 months you'll go, oh, it could happen, I suppose, initially. There might be some low-hanging fruit, yeah? But it's unlikely that you're going to get a game-changing improvement in the short term. You have to run the process consistently over a strategic time frame. F-series reconciliations, this is really important. Isolate the geoscience estimate from all other variables that might prevent an operation from achieving targets. So it's very important that you set targets and set plans and check against those targets and plans. But what this does is it takes that planning aspect out of the calculation and says, what was your estimate given what you actually did? So the buzzword can be hindcasting, not what you've forecast, but what you've hindcast. If we knew that this was the hole in the ground 3 months ago that we were going to exactly dig, what would we have predicted then? And that's really, really important, because it takes F-series reconciliation into one part of your business performance, and it takes compliance to plan into a separate but closely related. And if you can get them both together, you can analyze your business performance in great depth. F-series recons can routinely monitor a wide variety of business critical geoscience estimates. And in this case, we've spoken about lump and fines. So it doesn't have to just be tons and grade. It can be a variety of anything that you can estimate and then measure, you should be able to reconcile, at least theoretically. The most valuable outcome is when the root cause of the problem is discovered and addressed. So there's no value in just applying a numerical factor or an adjustment to a model to correct an estimate. Now, I will say what is sometimes done in our business is we know that there is an undefined problem causing the F2 for silica to be high. So we will build that into our plans and our targets, but never change the model. Because if you change the model, you will never diagnose the root cause. So reconciliation provides a key view on data quality and completeness. The number of data quality issues that we have discovered through doing this process is unknown but large. And like data quality and data completeness, getting everything of sufficient quality is absolutely critical to making this work, and that data is of extraordinary value to your business. Get that wrong and you will make mistakes without knowing it. Something that's very rarely discussed is this. I'm really into this. The consistent calculation of reconciliations during times of rapid change provides assurance that key aspects of the operation remain under control and that the changes are functioning as required. So in WAIO, over the last 3 years, we have seen extraordinary change. Pretty much all of our core software systems have been replaced. We've got new methods of doing grade control, a lot more RC/GC being done. We've got new methods of determining the grade of our grade control blockouts. We've got new estimation methods. We've got all this new stuff happening in this one space. So if I was a geoscience manager and I didn't have a process like this, I wouldn't be able to sleep at night, because how do I know it's all working? And the answer is it is working, because we are getting controlled reconciliation factors. And where it's not working, we can identify it and investigate. It would be wrong of me to stand up here and present for half an hour and not acknowledge the extraordinary help that I've had from a large number of people in the business. I'm not going to name them all now, but they are there, and reconciliations really is a team effort. There's a huge amount of work done by a lot of people. I just have the good fortune to sort of be the figurehead and do the presentation at the end. Thank you. Have we got time for...